The Peninsular War was a military conflict between Napoleon's empire and the Allied powers of Spain, Britain and Portugal for control of the Iberian Peninsula during the Napoleonic Wars. The war started when French and Spanish armies invaded and occupied Portugal in 1807, and escalated in 1808 when France turned on Spain, its ally until then. The war on the peninsula lasted until the Sixth Coalition defeated Napoleon in 1814, and is regarded as one of the first wars of national liberation. Significant for the emergence of large-scale guerrilla warfare, the Peninsular War overlaps with what the Spanish-speaking world calls the Guerra de la Independencia Espanola, which began with the Dos de Mayo uprising on the 2nd of May 1808 and ended on the 17th of April 1814. The French occupation destroyed the Spanish administration, which fragmented into quarreling provincial juntas. In 1810, a reconstituted national government, the Cádiz-Cortés, effectively a government in exile, fortified itself in Cádiz but could not raise effective armies because it was besieged by 70,000 French troops. British and Portuguese forces eventually secured Portugal, using it as a safe position from which to launch campaigns against the French army and to provide whatever supplies they could get to the Spanish. While the Spanish armies and guerrillas tied down vast numbers of Napoleon's troops, these combined regular and irregular Allied forces prevented Napoleon's marshals from subduing the rebellious Spanish provinces by restricting French control of territory. And the war continued through years of stalemate. The British Army under Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, guarded Portugal and campaigned against the French in Spain alongside the reformed Portuguese army. The demoralized Portuguese army was reorganized and refitted under the command of General William Carr Beresford, who had been appointed commander-in-chief of the Portuguese forces by the exiled Portuguese royal family, and fought as part of a combined Anglo-Portuguese army under Wellesley. In 1812, when Napoleon set out with a massive army on what proved to be a disastrous campaign to conquer Russia, a combined Allied army under Wellesley pushed into Spain, defeating the French at Salamanca and taking Madrid. In the following year, Wellington scored a decisive victory over King Joseph's army at Vittoria. Pursued by the armies of Britain, Spain and Portugal, Marshal John de Dussault, no longer able to get sufficient support from a depleted France, led the exhausted and demoralized French forces in a fighting withdrawal across the Pyrenees during the winter of 1813 to 1814. The years of fighting in Spain was a heavy burden on France's Grande Armée Écoutée. While the French were victorious in battle, their communications and supplies were severely tested and their units were frequently isolated, harassed or overwhelmed by partisans fighting an intense guerrilla war of raids and ambushes. The Spanish armies were repeatedly beaten and driven to the peripheries, but they would regroup and relentlessly hound the French. This drain on French resources led Napoleon, who had unwittingly provoked a total war, to call the conflict the Spanish Ulcer. War and revolution against Napoleon's occupation led to the Spanish Constitution of 1812, later a cornerstone of European liberalism. The burden of war destroyed the social and economic fabric of Portugal and Spain, and ushered in an era of social turbulence, political instability and economic stagnation. Devastating civil wars between liberal and absolutist factions led by officers trained in the Peninsular War persisted in Iberia until 1850. The cumulative crises and disruptions of invasion, revolution, and restoration led to the independence of most of Spain's American colonies and the independence of Brazil from Portugal. Origins. Subdued by its defeat in the Pyrenees War, Spain allied with France. In 1806, while in Berlin, Napoleon Bonaparte declared the Continental System, a blockade forbidding British imports into continental Europe. Neutral Portugal tried in vain to avoid Napoleon's ultimatum. Since 1373 it had had a treaty of alliance with England, which became an alliance with Great Britain, which then became an alliance with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, which cemented French dominance over Central and Eastern Europe, Napoleon decided to capture the Iberian ports. The decision went against Napoleon's own advice from earlier in his career. He had once remarked that the conquest of Spain would be too hard a nut to crack. On the 27th of October 1807, Spain's Prime Minister Manuel de Godoy signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau with France, agreeing that after Spain and France had defeated Portugal, it would be split into three kingdoms: the new Kingdom of Northern Lusitania, the Algarve, and a rump Kingdom of Portugal. In November 1807, after the refusal of the Prince Regent, John VI of Portugal, to join the continental system, Napoleon sent an army into Spain under General João Andos Junot with the task of invading Portugal. Godoy initially requested Portugal's alliance against the invading French armies, but later secretly agreed with France that in return for Spain's cooperation, it would receive Portugal's territories. Spain's main ambition was the seizure of the Portuguese fleet, and Spain therefore sent 2 divisions to help French troops occupy Portugal. Junot initiated the invasion of Portugal on 19 November 1807. The Portuguese army was positioned to defend the ports and coast against a French attack, and Lisbon was captured with no military opposition on 1 December. On 29 November, the escape of Maria I of Portugal and Prince Regent John, together with the administration and the court, around 10,000 people and 9,000 sailors aboard 23 Portuguese warships and 31 merchant ships, was a setback for Napoleon which enabled the Prince Regent to continue to rule over his overseas possessions, including Brazil. The Portuguese royal family would remain in Rio de Janeiro for the next 13 years. In 1807, Spain was experiencing political chaos and corruption. Charles IV was considered to be incompetent to run the country. Napoleon, now Emperor of the French, decided to take advantage of the dissensions in the Spanish court. Feigning sympathy with their situation, he listened to Charles and his son Ferdinand, inviting them to Paris. Ferdinand responded favorably to Napoleon's advice and asked for the hand of a Bonaparte princess. Napoleon played the part of an ally and coaxed the 2 Spaniards into believing he had friendly and peaceful intentions. In the absence of Charles and Ferdinand, Napoleon took the opportunity to invade Spain. All over Spain, townsfolk and peasants, who had been forced to bury family members in new municipal cemeteries, stole their bodies back at night and tried to restore them to the protection of the old resting places. In Madrid, the growing Francophilia of the court was met by the majors, shopkeepers, artisans, taverners and laborers who dressed in traditional style and took pleasure in picking fights with petimeters. Under the pretext of reinforcing the Franco-Spanish army occupying Portugal, French imperial troops entered Spain, where they were greeted with enthusiasm by the populace despite growing diplomatic unease. In February 1808, Napoleon turned on his ally and ordered French commanders to seize key Spanish fortresses. Barcelona was taken on 29 February 1808 when a French column disguised as a convoy of wounded soldiers persuaded the authorities to open the city's gates. Many commanders were not particularly concerned about the fate of the ruling regime, nor were they in any position to fight. The Spanish Royal Army of 100,000 men found itself paralyzed. It was under-equipped. For instance, its 26 cavalry regiments of 15,000 men possessed only 9,000 horses. It was frequently leaderless, confused by the turmoil in Madrid, and was scattered from Portugal to the Balearic Islands. 15,000 of its finest troops, Pedro Caro, 3rd Marquis of La Romana's division of the North, had been lent to Napoleon in 1807 and remained stationed in Denmark under French command. Only the peripheries contained armies of any strength. Joaquin Blake's Army of Galicia, and that of Andalusia, under Francisco Javier Castaños. The French were thus able to seize much of northeastern Spain by coups de main, and any hope of turning back the invasion ended. In March 1808, riots and a popular revolt at the Winter Palace in Aranjuez forced King Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son Ferdinand VII on the 19th of March. The rebellion seemed popular, inspired from outside the military. It was in effect a coup d'état by the Royal Guard. Challenged by this call to arms, Godoy and his royal patrons found they had few defenders. Ferdinand was hailed as a savior when he entered Madrid on the 24th of March. Alcala Galiano wrote, "The cheers were loud, repeated and delivered with eyes full of tears of pleasure. Kerchiefs were waved from balconies with hands trembling with pleasure, and not for a moment did the passion, or the thunderous noise of the joyful crowd diminish." Iberian Insurrections, 1808. Ever since the mutiny of Aranjuez, Spain had been astir. Attacks on Godoyistas were frequent, while the failure of the French to recognize Ferdinand caused much discontent and gave rise to the suspicion that they intended to bring back Godoy. By the beginning of May 1808, rumors were spreading that the Junta de Gobierno, the Council of Regency left behind by Ferdinand, was being pressured into sending the last members of the royal family to Bayonne. On the 2nd of May, the citizens of Madrid rebelled against the French occupation, killing 150 French soldiers before the uprising was put down by Joachim Murat's elite Imperial Guard and Mamluk cavalry, which crashed into the city and trampled the rioters. The next day, as immortalized by Francisco Goya in his painting the 3rd of May 1808, the French army shot hundreds of Madrid's citizens in retaliation. Similar reprisals occurred in other cities and continued for days, strengthening the resistance. Bloody, spontaneous fighting known as guerrilla erupted in much of Spain. Locally organized rebel groups were unaware of the resistance being prepared elsewhere in Spain. According to Esdale, the partisans were as committed to driving the ancient regime out of Spain as they were to fighting foreign armies. The patriots had no scruples about killing officials skeptical of their revolutionary program. When Ferdinand departed for Bayonne, he had left a structure of government headed by the Junta de Gobierno, presided over by Ferdinand's uncle, the Infante Don Antonio. It comprised the ministers appointed by Ferdinand to head the ministries of foreign affairs, war, finance, navy, and grace and justice, which since the reign of Carlos III had constituted the heart of the Spanish administration. Spain was divided into 32 provinces, each headed by a treasury official known as an intendente, and 14 military regions, each headed by a viceroy, captain general, commandant general. New heads were found for all the ministries. The Duque de Infantador, an old enemy of Godoy, was appointed president of the Council of Castile, and Gregorio Garcia de la Cuesta was made captain general of Old Castile. Despite a few officials having been driven from their posts by popular fury, the overall system was unchanged. Although the Spanish government, including the Council of Castile, had accepted Napoleon's decision to grant the Spanish crown to his brother Joseph, the Spanish population rejected Napoleon's plans and expressed their opposition through the local municipal and provincial governments. Following traditional Spanish political theories, which held that the monarchy was a contract between the monarch and the people, local governments responded to the crisis by transforming themselves into ad hoc governmental juntas. The first wave of uprisings that took place without any knowledge of revolt elsewhere were in Cartagena and Valencia on the 23rd of May. Zaragoza and Murcia on the 24th of May, and the province of Asturias, which cast out its French governor on the 25th of May, and declared war on Napoleon at the height of his greatness. Within weeks, all the Spanish provinces followed suit. In Cartagena, red cockades, the traditional badge of the Bourbon monarchy, were handed out to the people, and the garrison supported the rising, whereupon the captain-general and the military governor were arrested. A provincial junta was established under a prominent admiral. In Zaragoza, where José Palafox, a brigadier of the elite royal guards, had been hiding outside the city, the conspirators' agents steered the crowds into calling for him to lead them. The captain-general was imprisoned and Palafox was installed as de facto governor of Zaragoza and captain-general of Aragon. He wasted no time in declaring war on Napoleon and, with his elder brother, commanded a series of attacks against the French, and which led to the first siege of Zaragoza. Most major towns now had emergency administrations. Two exceptions were Cadiz, where the town council held sway, and Zaragoza, which was in the sole charge of Palafox, but the resultant juntas refused the bourgeois revolution of Marxist legend. The deteriorating strategic situation forced France to increase its military commitments. In February of 1808, Napoleon had boasted that 12,000 men could conquer Spain. By the 1st of June, over 65,000 troops were rushing into the country to control the crisis. The main French army of 80,000 held a narrow strip of central Spain from Pamplona and San Sebastian in the north to Madrid and Toledo in the south. The French in Madrid sheltered behind an additional 30,000 troops under Marshal Bon-Adrien Junot de Montcy. Jean Andoche Junot were stranded in Portugal, cut off by 300 miles of hostile territory, but within days of the outbreak of revolt, French columns in Old Castile, New Castile, Aragon and Catalonia were searching for the insurgent forces. Spain in revolt, 1808. Napoleon had expected popular risings, but believed that the Spanish army would either remain neutral or put itself under his command. From Murat's optimistic reports, Napoleon believed the uprisings would die down and Spain become peaceful if his brother retained the throne while French flying columns seized and pacified Spain's cities. He also had no respect for the insolent Spanish militias which opposed him. The First Army of Spain was outnumbered and had inferior troops. To this end, Pierre-Antoine Comte Dupont de l'Ourtang led 24,430 men south toward Seville and Cadiz. Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bessières moved into Aragon and Old Castile with 25,000 men, aiming to capture Santander and Zaragoza. Montcy marched toward Valencia with 29,350 men and Guillaume Philippe Duhesme marshaled 12,710 troops in Catalonia and moved against Girona. However, at the two successive battles of the Bruche, in the mountains some 50 kilometers outside Barcelona, Schwarz's 4,000 troops, marching from the city towards Zaragoza, were forced back following the heavy casualties inflicted on them by local Catalan militia, the Miquelets. Duhesme's Franco-Italian division of almost 6,000 troops failed to storm the city at the Girona, and leaving Chabrun's brigade to hold Mataro, was forced to return to Barcelona. In Aragon, Charles Comte Lefebvre Desnouettes, the commander of the 6,000-strong French force bearing down on Zaragoza, decided to rush the city. French calls for an honorable capitulation met with the reply, war to the knife. Resorting to urban warfare, Palafox defied the French for 3 months. Montcy's push toward the coast ended in defeat outside the walls of Valencia, where 1,000 French recruits died trying to storm the city. Managing to defeat Spanish counterattacks, Montcy began a long, harried retreat. In the north, the French found a measure of success when Bessières' march on Santander was checked by partisan attacks in July. The French turned back and encountered Blake and Cuesta with their combined army. In the Battle of Medina del Rio Seco, the Spanish generals, at Cuesta's insistence, hurried toward the vulnerable French supply lines at Valladolid. The two armies deployed on the 14th of July, but Cuesta had left a gap between his troops and Blake's which the French used to their advantage, and with Cuesta defeated, Old Castile returned to French control. Blake escaped, but the Spaniards lost at least 1,000 dead or wounded, 1,200 prisoners and 13 guns. French losses had been minimal, perhaps 400 men. Bessieres's victory salvaged the French army's strategic position in northern Spain. The road to Madrid lay open to Joseph, and the defeats at Girona, Valencia, and Zaragoza were forgotten. All that remained was to reinforce Dupont and allow him to force his way south through Andalusia. With the Spanish threat scattered, Joseph entered Madrid on the 20th of July, and on the 25th of July he was crowned King of Spain. A delighted Napoleon said, "If Marshal Bessieres has been able to beat the army of Galicia with few casualties and small effort, less than 8,000 troops being engaged, there can be no doubt that, with 20,000 men, General Dupont will be able to overthrow everybody he meets." However, on the 10th of June, every French ship of the line anchored at Cadiz was seized in the capture of the Rosalie squadron. Much alarmed, Dupont was disturbed enough to curtail his march at Córdoba, and then on the 16th of June to fall back to Andújar. Cowed by the mass hostility of the Andalusians, he broke off his offensive and was then defeated at the Battle of Bailén, where he surrendered his entire army corps to Castaños. The catastrophe was total. With the loss of 24,000 troops, Napoleon's military machine in Spain collapsed. Stunned by the defeat, on the 1st of August, Joseph, who had no more than 23,000 troops in Madrid and believed that thousands of vengeful Spaniards were about to attack him, evacuated the capital for Old Castile, whilst ordering Verdier to abandon the siege of Zaragoza and Bessieres to retire from Lyon. The entire French army sheltered behind the Ebro. By this time, Girona had resisted a second siege. Europe welcomed this first check to the hitherto unbeatable imperial armies. Bonaparte had been chased from his throne. Tales of Spanish heroism inspired Austria and showed the force of national resistance. Bailén set in motion the rise of the Fifth Coalition against Napoleon. According to Chandler, this was an historic occasion. News of it spread like wildfire throughout Spain and then all Europe. It was the first time since 1801 that a sizable French force had laid down its arms, and the legend of French invincibility underwent a severe shaking. Everywhere anti-French elements drew fresh inspiration from the tidings. The Pope published an open denunciation of Napoleon. Prussian patriots were heartened, and, most of all, the Austrian war party began to secure the support of the Emperor Francis for a renewed challenge to the French Empire.